Welcome back.
Today we dive into the harsh realities of life as a farmer in Edwardian England, exploring why this way of life was far tougher than most imagine. If you enjoy history, make sure to like this video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more fascinating insights from the past. Let's get started. Life in Edwardian England is often remembered as an age of elegance, refinement, and quiet confidence. A moment in history when the British Empire stood at its peak and society appeared to glide forward on polished shoes and carefully rehearsed manners. Yet this image, so often repeated in films and books, hides a far harsher truth that existed beyond the reach of grand estates and fashionable city streets. Because while the upper classes enjoyed the comforts of wealth and the middle classes embraced the promise of progress, millions of people living in the countryside experienced a very different reality, one defined not by luxury but by struggle, not by progress but by stagnation, and not by comfort but by a relentless battle against the limits of human endurance. And among them, farmers stood at the center of this forgotten world, forming the backbone of a nation that depended on their labor, yet offered them little in return. Their lives unfolding far from the spotlight of history, in fields that stretched across the English countryside, where beauty and hardship existed side by side in a fragile and often unforgiving balance. And to truly understand what it meant to live as a farmer during this time, one must first strip away the romanticized image of rural life that has been carefully constructed over generations, because the countryside was not a peaceful escape filled with gentle breezes and picturesque landscapes. It was a place where survival depended on constant effort, where every day brought new challenges, and where even the smallest mistake could carry devastating consequences. The rhythm of life here was not guided by comfort or choice, but by necessity, shaped by the demands of the land and the unyielding passage of time. And while cities were beginning to transform through industrial growth, technological advancement, and social change, the countryside remained largely untouched by these developments, leaving farmers caught in a world that seemed frozen, where traditions endured not out of preference, but because there were few alternatives. And this contrast between rural and urban life grew sharper with each passing year, as those in cities gained access to better wages, improved living conditions, and new opportunities, while farmers continued to work under conditions that had changed little for generations, creating a divide that was not just economic but deeply social, reinforcing a hierarchy that placed rural laborers at the bottom, their contributions essential yet undervalued, their voices rarely heard, and their struggles largely ignored by those who benefited from their work. And it is within this context that the true nature of Edwardian farming life begins to emerge, revealing a system that demanded everything from those who depended on it while offering almost nothing in return, a system sustained by the expectation that farmers would endure whatever hardships came their way, whether those hardships took the form of physical exhaustion, financial instability, or the constant uncertainty that defined their existence. And this expectation was so deeply ingrained that it became almost invisible, accepted as the natural order of things, rarely questioned and even more rarely challenged, because for many farmers there was no clear path out of this life, no opportunity to escape the conditions into which they had been born, their futures shaped long before they were old enough to understand them, bound to the land not only by necessity but by circumstance, tradition, and a lack of viable alternatives. And this sense of inevitability created a quiet resignation that permeated rural communities, a shared understanding that life would be difficult, and that endurance was not just a virtue but a requirement. And yet despite this resignation, there was also a deep resilience among farmers, a determination to continue in the face of adversity, driven by the simple need to survive and to provide for their families. And this resilience, while admirable, came at a cost, as it often masked the severity of their conditions, allowing the broader society to overlook the hardships they faced, because from a distance, the countryside still appeared calm and orderly, its fields neatly arranged, its villages quiet and seemingly content. But this appearance was deceptive, hiding the daily struggles that took place beneath the surface, struggles that were as real and as demanding as any found in the crowded factories of industrial cities, yet far less visible and far less acknowledged. And part of what made this reality so difficult was the isolation that defined rural life, not just physical isolation from urban centers, but also a social isolation that limited access to information, resources, and opportunities, leaving farmers disconnected from the changes that were beginning to reshape the rest of the country. And this isolation reinforced the sense that their world was separate, governed by its own rules and expectations, where progress arrived slowly if at all, and where survival depended more on endurance than innovation, and within this environment, the relationship between farmers and the land became central to every aspect of life, shaping not only their work but their identity, their routines, and their sense of purpose. The land was both a source of sustenance and a constant source of uncertainty, offering the possibility of survival while also threatening failure at any moment. And this dual nature created a tension that defined the farmer's existence, a constant balancing act between hope and fear, effort and outcome, control and vulnerability, and unlike many other forms of labor, farming offered no guarantee that hard work would lead to success, because even the most dedicated effort could be undone by forces beyond human control, and this lack of certainty made every decision more significant, every action more consequential. As farmers navigated a world where the margin for error was often painfully small, and yet despite these challenges, they were expected to continue, to work harder, to endure longer, and to accept whatever results came from their efforts, because there was little room for failure in a system that provided no safety net, no fallback, and no second chances. And this expectation was reinforced by the broader social structure of Edwardian England, which placed a high value on order, hierarchy, and tradition, often at the expense of those at the lower levels of society, including farmers, whose labor was essential but whose well-being was not a priority. And this imbalance created a situation in which the benefits of progress were unevenly distributed, flowing toward those with wealth and influence while bypassing those who worked the hardest to sustain the nation's economy. And this disparity was not always immediately visible, as the outward appearance of stability and prosperity masked the underlying inequalities that shaped daily life. But for farmers, these inequalities were impossible to ignore, experienced firsthand in the form of long hours, low wages, limited opportunities, and a constant struggle to make ends meet. And it is this combination of factors, the romanticized image of the era, the harsh realities of rural life, the isolation, the inequality, and the relentless demands of the land, that makes the experience of farmers in Edwardian England so important to understand, because it reveals a side of history that is often overlooked, a reminder that behind every image of progress and refinement lies a more complex and often more difficult truth. And by looking beyond the surface, by examining the lives of those who lived and worked in the countryside, we begin to see a fuller picture of the era, one that includes not only its achievements but also its struggles, not only its elegance but also its endurance. And in doing so, we gain a deeper appreciation for the people who made that world possible, even as they remained largely invisible within it, their stories woven into the fabric of history yet rarely told, their experiences shaping the reality of a time that continues to be remembered in ways that often overlook the very individuals who sustained it. And it is within this hidden narrative that the true cost of Edwardian progress can be found, not in the grand halls of the elite or the bustling streets of the cities, but in the quiet fields where farmers labored day after day, their lives defined by a struggle that was as constant as it was unrecognized, a struggle that challenges the polished image of the era and forces us to reconsider what it truly meant to live during this time, not as a member of the privileged few, but as one of the many who worked tirelessly behind the scenes, sustaining a society that rarely acknowledged their sacrifice. For the average farmer living in Edwardian England, life was defined by an unending cycle of labor that allowed no pause, no relief, and no real separation between work and existence, because farming was not simply a job that began at a certain hour and ended at another. It was a way of life that consumed every waking moment, demanding constant attention and physical effort in a world where survival depended entirely on the ability to keep going, day after day, regardless of exhaustion, illness, or circumstance. And this relentless routine began long before the first light of dawn touched the fields, when farmers would rise from their beds not out of choice but necessity, knowing that every hour mattered and that falling behind even slightly could have consequences that would ripple through the days and weeks to come. And as they stepped outside into the cold morning air, often damp and heavy with mist, they were immediately confronted with the reality of the work ahead, a list of tasks that never truly ended but only shifted and evolved with the seasons, each task demanding time, strength, and attention to detail. And there was no room for delay, because the land did not wait, the animals did not wait, and the fragile balance that sustained their livelihood did not allow for hesitation. And so the day would begin with the most urgent responsibilities, feeding livestock that depended entirely on human care, ensuring that animals were healthy, watered, and ready for the day. because neglecting even a single aspect of their care could lead to illness, reduced productivity, or loss. And each of these outcomes carried not just emotional weight but financial consequences that could be devastating for families already living on the edge of survival. And once the animals were tended to, attention would turn to the fields, where the real test of endurance awaited, because working the land required not only physical strength, but also a deep understanding of timing, weather, and soil, knowledge that was often passed down through generations, yet constantly challenged by the unpredictable nature of farming. And the tools available to farmers during this time did little to ease the burden, as most relied on basic hand tools such as hoes, spades, and sickles, along with horse-drawn plows that required skill and coordination to operate effectively. And while mechanization was beginning to appear in some areas, it remained largely inaccessible to smaller farmers due to its cost, leaving the majority to rely on methods that had changed little over centuries, methods that demanded long hours of repetitive, physically demanding work that took a toll on the body over time, wearing down muscles, straining joints, and leaving little opportunity for rest or recovery. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, the intensity of the labor did not lessen but often increased, with farmers moving steadily from one task to another, planting seeds in neat rows, weeding out unwanted growth that threatened to steal nutrients from the crops, repairing fences that kept animals contained, and constantly monitoring the condition of the land to ensure that everything was progressing as it should, because even the smallest oversight could lead to larger problems that were far more difficult to correct later. And this constant vigilance created a mental strain that was just as significant as the physical demands, as farmers were required to think ahead, to anticipate potential issues, and to make decisions that could determine the success or failure of an entire season. And yet, despite this level of responsibility, their work was often undervalued, seen as simple or routine by those who did not understand the complexity involved. And this lack of recognition added another layer of difficulty to a life that was already filled with challenges. And as the day continued, there was little opportunity for breaks. Meals were often quick and practical, eaten in the fields or near the work site, consisting of whatever simple food was available. And even these brief moments of rest were overshadowed by the knowledge that there was still more to be done. Because the work of a farmer was never truly finished, it only paused briefly before resuming with the same intensity. And as afternoon turned to evening, the tasks would shift once again, with attention returning to the animals, ensuring they were fed and secured for the night, checking for any signs of illness or injury, and preparing for the next day's work, which would begin all over again with little variation. And this repetition, while necessary, created a sense of monotony that could be mentally exhausting, as each day blended into the next with few distinctions or moments of relief. And yet, even as the sun set and darkness began to fall, the work did not always end, because there were times when additional tasks demanded attention, whether it was repairing equipment, tending to an animal in distress, dealing with unexpected problems that could not be postponed. And these moments reinforced the reality that farming was not bound by time in the way other occupations might be. It was governed instead by need, by the demands of the land and the living creatures that depended on it. And this meant that farmers were always on call, always ready to respond, even when their bodies were exhausted and their energy nearly depleted. And this constant state of readiness took a significant toll over time, not only physically but emotionally, as the lack of rest and the unending nature of the work left little space for relaxation, personal pursuits, or even meaningful social interaction. And this isolation was compounded by the fact that farming communities were often spread out, with neighbors living at a distance, making it difficult to build strong social connections or to find support in times of need. And while there was a sense of shared experience among those who lived this life, it did not always translate into practical assistance, as everyone was facing their own challenges and had limited capacity to help others. And this created an environment in which farmers had to rely heavily on themselves and their immediate families, working together to manage the demands of the land, with each member contributing in whatever way they could, including women and children, whose labor was essential to the functioning of the farm yet often overlooked or undervalued. And for children, this meant growing up quickly, taking on responsibilities at a young age, and becoming part of the cycle of labor that defined their family's existence, learning the skills they would need to continue this way of life in the future, often with little opportunity for formal education or alternative paths. And this continuity ensured that the system persisted, with each generation inheriting not only the knowledge of farming but also the hardships that came with it. And as time passed, The cumulative effect of this relentless labor became increasingly apparent, as the physical strain led to chronic health issues, injuries that were difficult to treat due to limited medical access, and a general weariness that settled into the body and mind, making each new day feel heavier than the last. And yet, despite these challenges, farmers continued to work, driven by necessity and a sense of responsibility that left little room for choice, because stopping was not an option, slowing down was not an option, and the idea of stepping away from this life was often unrealistic given the limited opportunities available elsewhere. And this lack of mobility reinforced the sense of being trapped within a system that demanded everything while offering little in return. And even as broader societal changes began to take shape during the Edwardian period, bringing new technologies, new ideas, and new possibilities to parts of the country, these changes reached the countryside slowly, if at all, leaving many farmers to continue their work much as their ancestors had done, bound to the rhythms of the land and the expectations of a society that depended on their labor yet did little to improve their conditions. And it is within this context that the true weight of a farmer's daily life becomes clear, not as a series of isolated tasks, but as a continuous, unbroken chain of effort that defined every aspect of existence, shaping not only how they spent their time, but how they understood their place in the world, a place that required strength, endurance, and an unwavering commitment to a way of life that was as demanding as it was essential. And while it may be easy to look back on this period and see only the surface of rural life, the quiet fields and the simple routines, a closer examination reveals the depth of the labor involved, the intensity of the effort required, and the profound impact that this unending work had on those who lived it, creating a reality that was far removed from the romanticized images often associated with the countryside, a reality in which every day was a test of endurance, every task a necessary step toward survival, and every moment shaped by the demands of a life that never truly allowed for rest. Despite the endless labor that defined their daily existence, the farmers of Edwardian England rarely saw the rewards one might expect from such relentless effort, because hard work did not guarantee comfort, security, or even basic stability, and instead of prosperity, most farmers found themselves trapped in a cycle of poverty that was as persistent as it was unforgiving, shaping every aspect of their lives and limiting their ability to escape the conditions into which they had been born. And this poverty was not always dramatic or sudden, but often slow and grinding, a constant pressure that wore people down over time, influencing the way they lived, the choices they made, and the expectations they held for the future. And it began with the simple reality that the income generated from farming was often barely enough to cover the most basic necessities, because prices for agricultural goods were unstable and frequently low, influenced by market forces that farmers had little control over, including competition from imported produce, fluctuations in demand, and broader economic conditions that could shift without warning, leaving farmers vulnerable to changes that could quickly reduce their already limited earnings. And even in years when the harvest was relatively successful, the profit margins were so narrow that there was little room for savings, meaning that any unexpected expense, whether it was a broken tool, a sick animal, or a poor yield in the following season, could push a family into deeper financial hardship. And this constant financial strain created an environment in which planning for the future was extremely difficult, because survival depended on getting through the present, and the idea of long-term security often felt out of reach. And the homes in which farmers lived reflected this reality, as many cottages were small, overcrowded, and poorly constructed, often built with inexpensive materials that offered little protection against the elements, with walls that allowed cold air and moisture to seep inside, roofs that leaked during heavy rain, and floors that were uneven or damp, creating living conditions that were uncomfortable at best and unhealthy at worst. And heating was limited, typically relying on small fires that required a steady supply of fuel, which was not always easy to obtain, especially during the colder months, and as a result, winters could be particularly harsh, with families huddling together in an attempt to stay warm, their living spaces offering little relief from the biting cold. And sanitation was another major challenge, as many rural homes lacked proper plumbing or waste disposal systems, leading to conditions that increased the risk of disease, and clean water was not always readily available, requiring time and effort to collect, and even then, it was not guaranteed to be safe. And these factors combined to create an environment in which illness could spread more easily, further complicating an already difficult life. And when it came to food, the situation was equally challenging, as farmers did not necessarily enjoy a varied or abundant diet despite their role in producing food, because much of what they grew was intended for sale rather than personal consumption, leaving them to rely on whatever they could afford to keep or obtain at a low cost, and this often meant meals that were simple, repetitive, and lacking in nutritional balance, consisting primarily of bread, potatoes, and small amounts of vegetables, with meat being a rare treat reserved for special occasions or times when it could not be sold. And this limited diet could lead to deficiencies that affected overall health, particularly for children, whose growth and development depended on adequate nutrition, and the impact of poverty extended beyond physical conditions to influence social dynamics as well, because limited financial resources restricted access to education, opportunities, and experiences that might have allowed individuals to improve their circumstances. And for many children growing up in farming families, formal schooling was either brief or inconsistent, as their labor was needed to support the household, and this lack of education made it more difficult to pursue alternative paths later in life, effectively reinforcing the cycle of poverty across generations. And the absence of a social safety net further intensified these challenges, because there were few systems in place to provide assistance during times of hardship, and while some charitable organizations existed, their reach was limited and often insufficient to meet the needs of those struggling in rural areas, leaving farmers to rely primarily on their own resources and the support of their immediate community, which, while valuable, was itself constrained by the shared difficulties faced by everyone involved. And this meant that when a crisis occurred, such as a failed harvest, a serious illness, or the loss of livestock, the consequences could be severe and long-lasting, pushing families into debt that was difficult to repay, and debt once incurred became another burden to carry, adding to the stress and uncertainty that already defined daily life, as repayments had to be managed alongside ongoing expenses, often requiring further sacrifices and compromises that reduced the quality of life even further. And this financial pressure also affected relationships between farmers and those who held economic power, including landowners, merchants, and lenders, who could dictate terms that were not always favorable, taking advantage of the limited options available to those in need. And this imbalance of power contributed to a sense of vulnerability and lack of control, as farmers navigated a system that offered little protection and few opportunities for advancement. And even when they worked tirelessly to improve their situation, the structural limitations they faced often made significant progress difficult to achieve, and this could lead to a sense of frustration and resignation, as the effort required to maintain even a basic standard of living remained consistently high, while the rewards remained minimal. And the psychological impact of this situation should not be underestimated, because living under constant financial strain can affect mental well-being, creating anxiety, stress, and a persistent sense of insecurity, as individuals worry about their ability to provide for themselves and their families. And this emotional burden was compounded by the physical demands of farming, creating a situation in which both body and mind were under continuous pressure, with little opportunity for rest or recovery. And yet, despite these challenges, farmers continued to persevere, driven by necessity, responsibility, and a deep connection to the land that, while often a source of hardship, was also central to their identity and sense of purpose. And this persistence speaks to a level of resilience that is both remarkable and sobering, because it highlights the extent to which people were able to endure difficult conditions while also underscoring the lack of alternatives available to them. And it is important to recognize that this poverty was not simply the result of individual circumstances or choices, but was shaped by broader economic and social structures that limited opportunities and distributed resources unevenly, creating a system in which those who worked the hardest were not necessarily those who benefited the most. And this imbalance was a defining feature of the era, influencing not only the lives of farmers, but the overall character of rural society. And when we consider the image of Edwardian England as a time of grace and progress, it becomes clear that this image is incomplete, because it does not fully account for the experiences of those who lived outside the centers of wealth and influence, those whose daily lives were marked by struggle rather than comfort. And by examining the realities of poverty in the countryside, we gain a more nuanced understanding of the period, one that acknowledges both its achievements and its shortcomings, and that recognizes the contributions of farmers not only in terms of the food they produced, but in the endurance they demonstrated in the face of persistent adversity. And this deeper understanding allows us to see beyond the surface of history, to appreciate the complexity of the past, and to remember that behind every era defined by progress and prosperity, There are always stories of hardship and resilience that deserve to be told and understood in their full context, revealing a reality that is far more challenging and far more human than the simplified narratives that are often presented. For those working the land in Edwardian England, no force was more powerful, more unpredictable, or more unforgiving than the weather, because while effort, skill, and experience all played important roles in farming, they could be undone in an instant by conditions that lay completely beyond human control. And this reality shaped every aspect of a farmer's life, creating a constant awareness that no matter how carefully they planned or how hard they worked, their success ultimately depended on factors they could neither predict with certainty nor influence in any meaningful way, and this dependence on nature introduced a level of uncertainty that was both practical and deeply psychological, as farmers were required to make decisions based on incomplete information, relying on observation, tradition, and instinct to guide them through a process that was inherently unstable. And while generations of experience had provided a framework for understanding seasonal patterns, the weather itself remained unpredictable, capable of shifting suddenly and dramatically, turning what had seemed like a promising season into a period of loss and hardship. And this unpredictability meant that every stage of the agricultural cycle carried its own risks, beginning with the preparation of the soil, which depended on the right balance of moisture and temperature, because soil that was too wet could become heavy and difficult to work, preventing proper plowing and delaying planting, while soil that was too dry could harden, making it resistant to tools and less able to support the growth of crops. And even at this early stage, farmers had to make careful judgments about when to begin their work, knowing that mistiming their efforts could have consequences that would affect the entire season. And once seeds were planted, the stakes only increased, as the success of germination depended on favorable conditions that were never guaranteed, with too much rain threatening to wash seeds away or cause them to rot before they could take root, while insufficient rainfall could prevent them from sprouting at all, leaving fields barren despite the time and effort invested in preparing them. And as crops began to grow, the influence of weather continued to shape their development, with temperature playing a critical role in determining the rate of growth, because crops required warmth to thrive, yet excessive heat could be just as damaging as cold, causing plants to wilt, reducing yields and in severe cases, killing entire sections of a field. And the risk of frost added another layer of uncertainty, particularly in the early spring and late autumn, when a sudden drop in temperature could destroy young plants or damage mature crops just before harvest, wiping out months of work in a single night. And this ever-present threat forced farmers to remain vigilant, constantly monitoring the sky, the air, and the condition of their fields, looking for signs that might indicate a change in weather. And while they developed a keen awareness of their environment, this awareness did not grant them control, only a slightly better chance of anticipating what might come next. And even then, predictions were far from reliable, leaving farmers in a position where they could prepare but never fully protect themselves from the impact of adverse conditions. And rainfall, perhaps more than any other factor, exemplified this delicate balance, because water was essential for crops, yet its distribution was rarely ideal, with periods of heavy rain sometimes followed by stretches of drought, creating a cycle of extremes that placed additional stress on the land and the plants growing within it. And heavy rain could lead to waterlogged soil, reducing oxygen levels around plant roots and increasing the likelihood of disease, while also making it difficult or impossible to work in the fields, delaying essential tasks such as weeding, fertilizing, or harvesting. And these delays could have cascading effects, as crops that were not tended at the right time might fail to reach their full potential, reducing both quality and quantity. And on the other hand, drought conditions presented their own set of challenges, as prolonged periods without sufficient rainfall could cause crops to wither, limit their growth, and ultimately result in significantly reduced yields. And without modern irrigation systems, which were largely unavailable to most farmers at the time, there was little that could be done to mitigate the effects of drought, leaving farmers to watch as their fields gradually lost vitality, their efforts slipping away despite their best attempts to preserve what they could. And wind also played a significant role in shaping outcomes, because strong winds could damage crops directly by breaking stems or uprooting plants, while also increasing evaporation rates, exacerbating the effects of dry conditions. And in some cases, storms brought a combination of wind and rain that could flatten entire fields, making harvesting more difficult and reducing the overall quality of the produce. And these events were not rare occurrences but part of the normal variability of weather, meaning that farmers had to contend with them regularly, incorporating the possibility of loss into their expectations, while still striving for success. And this constant exposure to risk created a sense of vulnerability that was difficult to escape, as each season brought with it a new set of uncertainties, and even when conditions were favorable for a time, there was always the possibility that they could change suddenly, undoing the progress that had been made, and this lack of stability made it challenging to build confidence or to rely on past success as an indicator of future outcomes. Because each year was different, each season unique, and the lessons learned from one experience did not always apply to the next, and beyond the direct impact on crops, weather also influenced the health and productivity of livestock, which were an essential component of many farms, as animals depended on consistent access to food and water, both of which could be affected by environmental conditions, with drought reducing the availability of grazing land and heavy rain creating muddy, unsanitary conditions that increased the risk of disease, and extreme temperatures, whether hot or cold, could place additional stress on animals, affecting their growth, reproduction, and overall well-being, and farmers had to adapt their care practices accordingly, providing shelter, adjusting feeding routines, and taking steps to protect their livestock as best they could. Yet even these efforts could not fully shield animals from the effects of severe weather, leading to losses that further compounded the challenges faced by farming families, and the cumulative effect of these factors was a way of life defined by uncertainty, where outcomes were never guaranteed, and where success often depended as much on favorable conditions as it did on hard work and skill. And this reality required farmers to develop a mindset that could accommodate both hope and acceptance, as they worked toward the best possible outcome while recognizing that failure was always a possibility. And this dual perspective influenced not only their approach to farming but their broader outlook on life, shaping attitudes toward risk, resilience, and the future, and it also contributed to a sense of humility in the face of nature, and understanding that despite their efforts, they were part of a system that operated on a scale far beyond their control, and this understanding, while grounded in experience, did not lessen the emotional impact of loss when it occurred, because each failed crop, each damaged field, and each lost animal represented not just a setback but a tangible reduction in the resources available to sustain a family. And in a context where margins were already narrow, these losses could have serious consequences, affecting the ability to meet financial obligations, to provide adequate food, and to prepare for the next season, and without effective means of mitigating these risks, such as insurance or advanced forecasting, farmers were left to absorb the full impact of adverse weather, relying on their resilience and resourcefulness to navigate the challenges that arose. And while some seasons brought relative success, allowing for a degree of stability, others brought hardship that could take years to recover from, creating a pattern of fluctuation that made long-term planning difficult and reinforced the sense that farming was as much a gamble as it was a profession. And this perception was not an exaggeration but a reflection of the reality that outcomes were often uncertain, and that even the most diligent efforts could be undermined by circumstances beyond human influence. And in this way the weather functioned not just as a background condition but as a central force in the lives of farmers, shaping their work, their decisions, and their experiences in ways that were both immediate and far-reaching. And by understanding this relationship, we gain a deeper appreciation for the challenges they faced, recognizing that their struggles were not solely the result of human systems or social structures, but also of the natural environment in which they lived and worked, an environment that provided the resources necessary for survival while simultaneously imposing limits and risks that could not be ignored. And it is within this complex interplay between human effort and natural forces that the true nature of farming in Edwardian England can be understood, revealing a life that required not only physical strength and practical knowledge but also a capacity to endure uncertainty and to persist in the face of conditions that were often beyond control. A life in which the outcome of months of labor could hinge on a few days of weather, and the line between success and failure was as thin and as shifting as the clouds in the sky. For farmers living in Edwardian England, the challenges of daily labor and unpredictable weather were compounded by a social and economic system that placed them at a distinct disadvantage, because most did not own the land they worked and were instead tenants bound to estates owned by wealthy landowners who held the power to dictate terms, set rents, and enforce rules that could significantly affect a family's livelihood. And this relationship created a constant pressure that was both financial and psychological, as farmers had to balance their own needs, the demands of the land, and the expectations of those who held authority over the property, knowing that failure to meet obligations could result in eviction, loss of access to resources, or other forms of punishment, and the rent itself often consumed a substantial portion of any income generated from the farm, leaving little for household necessities, improvement of tools, or investment in crops. And this financial pressure was amplified by the fact that tenants were frequently required to pay additional fees for the use of equipment, livestock, or other essentials provided by the landowner, creating a complex system of obligations that was difficult to navigate and easy to fall behind in. And failure to meet these obligations carried real consequences, sometimes forcing families to take on debt, borrow from neighbors, or reduce their own consumption in order to make ends meet. And this dependence on landlords underscored the imbalance of power that characterized rural society. Because while the tenant worked tirelessly to sustain both themselves and the landowner's property, the landowner's comfort and wealth were rarely threatened, and they could rely on legal, social, and economic systems that reinforced their control, leaving tenants vulnerable and with little recourse. And this power imbalance extended beyond financial obligations to influence nearly every aspect of rural life, from the ability to make decisions about planting and harvesting to the autonomy over daily routines, as tenants often had to adhere to the schedules, standards, and expectations set by those who owned the land, and this lack of autonomy created a sense of dependency that was difficult to escape, because even families who were skilled, hard-working, and experienced were still subject to external authority that could override their knowledge and preferences. And this dynamic contributed to a broader pattern of inequality that was deeply ingrained in Edwardian society, where social status, wealth, and access to resources were unevenly distributed, creating a clear division between those who had power and those who did not. And within this context, farmers occupied a position near the bottom, their labor essential to the functioning of the economy, yet their well-being largely overlooked by the structures that governed society. And the contrast between the lives of wealthy landowners and those who worked the land could not have been more stark, as landowners enjoyed comfortable homes, leisure time, education, and influence, while tenants worked long hours in often harsh conditions with limited prospects for improvement. And this disparity was not merely a matter of lifestyle but had profound implications for security, opportunity, and the ability to shape one's own future, because the conditions faced by farmers limited access to education, restricted social mobility, and constrained the ability to accumulate wealth or build a stable household, and these limitations were reinforced by the intergenerational nature of tenancy, as families often continued to live and work on the same land for decades, passing the same obligations and constraints from one generation to the next, with few options to escape the cycle. And even when individuals aspired to acquire their own land or improve their circumstances, the financial and social barriers were formidable, requiring resources that were rarely available and opportunities that were rarely offered. And this reality meant that for many farmers, life was defined by endurance rather than choice, a continuous negotiation between the demands placed upon them and the limited control they could exert over their own destiny. And this lack of control extended to the tools and techniques available to them, because decisions about crop rotation, access to machinery, or investment in infrastructure often required permission or resources from landlords, limiting the ability of farmers to innovate, experiment, or improve productivity. And the consequences of these limitations were tangible, as inefficient or outdated practices could reduce yields, increase labor, and exacerbate the physical and financial strain that characterized rural life, while the benefits of innovation were often captured by those who owned the land, reinforcing the economic disparity and leaving tenants with the burden of work and the risk of failure. And this system also influenced social relations within rural communities, because the authority of landlords extended beyond the purely economic into local governance, social expectations, and access to justice, meaning that farmers were often constrained by rules and norms that reflected the interests of the wealthy rather than the needs of those who lived and labored on the land. And this lack of agency could create a sense of powerlessness, as families were aware that their efforts, while essential, were subject to the judgment, preferences, and priorities of others, and any challenge to this authority could carry social, legal, or economic risks, reinforcing conformity and limiting resistance. And these dynamics had broader implications for the social structure of the countryside, as the dependence of tenants on landowners helped maintain hierarchical relationships, social stratification, and the concentration of wealth, even as the contributions of those at the lower levels were indispensable to sustaining the system. And within this framework, inequality became normalized, internalized, and difficult to contest because the structure of society, the economic arrangements, and the cultural expectations all combined to create a reality in which power was concentrated and opportunity was constrained. And while some tenants might achieve modest improvements through hard work, frugality, or luck, these successes were exceptions rather than the rule, and the structural factors that limited mobility persisted, ensuring that poverty, dependence, and limited opportunity remained defining features of rural life, and the implications of this imbalance extended beyond economics to affect daily experience, mental well-being, and the possibilities available to future generations, because children born into tenant farming families inherited not only the work but also the social position, financial constraints, and limited access to education and resources, perpetuating the cycle of dependence and inequality. And this cycle created a situation in which farming, despite its essential contribution to the economy and society, remained a precarious and challenging occupation, with rewards that were often minimal and risks that were considerable, and even the physical space in which farmers lived reflected this disparity, as cottages were often small, poorly constructed, and designed to meet the bare minimum requirements, reinforcing the sense that those who labored the hardest were entitled to the least. And within these homes, families shared limited resources, crowded spaces, and the daily pressures of survival, making the struggle to meet basic needs a constant reality. And when combined with the demands of labor, the unpredictability of weather, and the limited agency over their work, the experience of tenant farmers emerges as one of persistent hardship, endurance, and adaptation, a life defined by navigating a complex system of obligations, dependencies, and vulnerabilities. And despite these challenges, farmers continued to work the land, demonstrating resilience, skill, and a deep connection to their environment, while simultaneously being constrained by forces that were beyond their control, forces that included landlords, market pressures, and social hierarchies that reinforced their position. And by understanding this relationship between tenants and landowners, we gain insight into the broader structural inequalities of Edwardian England, the ways in which wealth and power were concentrated, and the lived reality of those whose labor made the system function, yet who rarely shared in its benefits. And this perspective helps to illuminate the social, economic, and psychological pressures faced by farmers, revealing the complexity of rural life, the limitations imposed by dependence, and the resilience required to endure within such a system, while also highlighting the stark contrast between those who benefited from the work and those who performed it, a contrast that is central to understanding the lived experience of farming during the period and the enduring impact of social and economic inequality on rural communities. For farmers living in Edwardian England, life was not only defined by relentless labor, unpredictable weather, and dependence on landlords, but also by a profound sense of isolation and limited access to resources that compounded every challenge they faced, because rural communities were often spread out across vast stretches of farmland, with neighbors sometimes miles away, and the nearest town or village center, where markets, schools, and medical services might be found, was often a significant journey, making it difficult for families to access the support systems, social interactions, or basic necessities that could ease the burdens of daily life. And this physical isolation was reinforced by social isolation, because opportunities for education, social mobility, and connection to broader networks were limited, leaving farmers and their families to rely primarily on themselves and immediate kin for survival, guidance, and emotional support. And while there was often a strong sense of community among rural neighbors, this support was constrained by shared hardship, as everyone faced the same economic, environmental, and social pressures, limiting their ability to provide meaningful assistance when crises arose. And this combination of physical and social isolation created a situation in which families were largely self-reliant, responsible for solving problems that in other contexts might have been addressed by local institutions, government services, or extended networks. And the demands of self-reliance extended to education, as children were often required to contribute to the farm from a young age, learning practical skills and labor practices rather than receiving formal schooling. And while some education might be available in the form of small local schools, attendance was frequently inconsistent, interrupted by seasonal labor needs or economic necessity, limiting literacy, numeracy, and opportunities to engage with broader social, technological, or economic developments. And this restricted access to education had long-term consequences, because it limited the potential for upward mobility, the ability to diversify occupations, or the knowledge required to adopt new agricultural methods that might improve efficiency or yield. And in addition to education, access to healthcare was severely constrained because medical services were sparse in rural areas, with doctors located far from isolated farms, and transportation limited, making even minor illnesses or injuries potentially dangerous. And this lack of access meant that simple conditions could become serious or fatal if left untreated, placing an additional burden on families who had to manage care themselves, and often without proper knowledge, supplies, or assistance. And this situation was exacerbated by the physical demands of farm work, which exposed individuals to injuries such as cuts, bruises, broken bones, or more serious accidents involving heavy machinery, animals, or environmental hazards, and recovery from these injuries was often slow and incomplete. Because rest was limited, labor continued, and professional medical treatment was difficult to obtain, leaving long-term physical consequences that could reduce the ability to work effectively, further entrenching cycles of hardship. And this combination of isolation, risk, and self-reliance shaped daily routines in profound ways, as farmers had to structure their days around not only the work required by the land and animals, but also the contingencies imposed by distance from services, the limited availability of labor, and the unpredictable elements of the environment, creating schedules that were rigid, exhausting, and continuous, with few opportunities for interruption or leisure. And even moments that might seem minor in other contexts, such as the need to repair a fence, maintain a roof, or fetch water, became significant events that consumed time, energy, and planning, as delays could have cascading effects on productivity, safety, and family well-being. And this constant management of multiple responsibilities created mental strain as well as physical fatigue, because individuals had to prioritize tasks, anticipate problems, and make critical decisions under conditions of uncertainty. And while resilience and adaptability were essential qualities, they also imposed a psychological burden, as the weight of responsibility rested heavily on the shoulders of farmers and their families, with little room for error or indulgence. And over time, this combination of labor, uncertainty, and isolation shaped not only daily routines, but broader attitudes toward life, work, and the future, fostering a mindset of pragmatism, endurance, and cautious optimism, as well as a keen awareness of risk, reward, and the limits of control. And within this framework, social interactions, cultural practices, and family dynamics were all influenced by the constraints imposed by environment and circumstance, because relationships, celebrations, and community events had to be negotiated around labor demands, seasonal cycles, and the physical realities of distance, weather, and resource availability. And this created a social rhythm that was closely tied to the land and the work it demanded, reinforcing patterns of dependence, cooperation, and shared experience, but also limiting the variety and spontaneity of daily life. And as the Edwardian period progressed, broader societal changes began to reach rural communities, introducing new technologies, agricultural methods, and social reforms. Yet these innovations were often slow to arrive and uneven in their impact, leaving many farmers to continue much as they had for generations, relying on traditional techniques, inherited knowledge, and sheer endurance to meet the demands of survival. And this gradual change underscored the tension between continuity and transformation in rural life, as families balanced the benefits of innovation with the risks and costs associated with adopting new practices, and with limited capital, uncertain markets, and reliance on landlords or local authorities. The adoption of new methods was often tentative, partial, or delayed, further reinforcing the persistence of traditional practices despite broader trends toward modernization. And in addition to technological and methodological challenges, rural isolation also affected access to markets and economic opportunities, because transporting goods to buyers, negotiating fair prices, and responding to fluctuations in demand required infrastructure, knowledge, and resources that were often scarce. And delays, spoilage, or exploitation could reduce profitability, limiting the ability of families to accumulate savings, invest in improvements, or weather periods of low income. And this economic vulnerability was reinforced by the absence of formal social safety nets, as government support, insurance, or welfare systems were minimal or non-existent, leaving families to absorb the full impact of poor harvests, livestock losses, or market downturns. And when compounded with the environmental, social, and structural pressures already described, these factors created a life of persistent risk, where stability was fragile and security was elusive. And yet despite these challenges, families persisted, cultivating crops, tending animals, and maintaining households with skill, resourcefulness, and resilience. And this persistence was not merely functional but also cultural, reflecting values of hard work, self-reliance, endurance, and commitment that were passed down through generations, forming the backbone of rural society and sustaining communities in conditions that were often harsh, isolating, and unforgiving. And in considering the broader picture, it becomes clear that farming life in Edwardian England was shaped not only by the physical demands of labor and the unpredictability of weather, but also by the social, economic, and institutional constraints that imposed limits on autonomy, mobility, and opportunity, creating a reality in which survival required constant vigilance, careful planning, and unwavering dedication. And yet even with these burdens, farmers maintained a connection to the land, a knowledge of its rhythms, and a commitment to its cultivation that was both practical and deeply meaningful, reflecting an understanding of the interdependence between human effort and environmental conditions, and a recognition that endurance, skill, and resilience were essential not only to economic survival, but also to the maintenance of family, community, and tradition. And by examining this complex interplay of isolation, labor, risk, and adaptation, we gain a richer understanding of what it meant to live as a farmer during this period, revealing a life that was simultaneously constrained and vital, exhausting and sustaining, precarious and purposeful. And through this lens, the isolation, struggle, and gradual change experienced by Edwardian farmers emerge as central to the historical understanding of rural life, highlighting both the challenges and the resilience that defined their experience, and offering insight into the ways in which human communities navigate adversity, adapt to constraints, and maintain continuity in the face of persistent pressures from environment, society, and economic structure. And by appreciating the depth and complexity of this lived experience, we come to see that the story of Edwardian farmers is not merely one of labor or hardship, but also one of endurance, ingenuity, and the profound human capacity to persist in conditions that demand relentless effort, careful management, and a nuanced understanding of both the limitations and the possibilities inherent in their environment. And this perspective illuminates the broader historical context, allowing us to recognize the interconnectedness of labor, social hierarchy, environmental dependency, and cultural adaptation, and to understand that the isolation and challenges faced by rural communities were not merely incidental, but central to the shaping of their daily lives, their identities, and their legacies, and ultimately to the functioning of the society that depended on them. And through this understanding, we can appreciate the full scope of what life entailed for farmers in Edwardian England, a life of unceasing effort, constant vigilance, and enduring connection to both the land and the social structures that governed it, revealing a story of survival, resilience, and adaptation that forms a critical part of the historical record. As the years passed, the relentless combination of labor, isolation, financial pressure, and environmental uncertainty left deep marks on the farmers of Edwardian England, not just in the immediate challenges of daily life, but in long-term physical, mental, and social consequences that shaped their existence and the lives of generations to come. Because working the land under such demanding conditions exacted a physical toll that few occupations could match, and the effects of this labor accumulated gradually, manifesting in chronic pain, injuries, fatigue, and general deterioration of health as decades of repetitive motions, heavy lifting, bending, and exposure to the elements weakened muscles, strained joints, and left the body vulnerable to illness and long-term disability. And medical care, when available, was often inadequate, expensive, or difficult to access, meaning that minor injuries could fester into serious conditions, infections could take hold without proper treatment, and illnesses such as rheumatism, respiratory infections, and malnutrition-related disorders could linger or worsen, while mental fatigue compounded these issues, because constant vigilance, planning, and worry over crops, livestock, weather, and financial obligations created a psychological burden that was both invisible and persistent, leaving farmers with stress, anxiety, and emotional exhaustion that few outside their communities could fully understand. And this mental strain was intensified by the cyclical nature of farming, as the end of one season often directly led into the beginning of another, allowing little time for reflection, rest, or recovery, so that individuals were caught in a near-perpetual state of preparedness and effort, rarely able to disengage from the demands of survival. And over time, this combination of physical and mental exhaustion influenced family dynamics, because each member of a household had to contribute to labor from a young age. children learning to sow, weed, tend animals, and assist with chores long before they might have had the chance to pursue formal education, while women balanced both farm work and domestic responsibilities, often managing households, preparing meals, caring for children, and assisting with animals and crops, creating an environment in which every family member was integral to survival, but also burdened with responsibilities that left little room for personal development, rest, or leisure, and the emotional pressures within these households were significant, because the constant struggle to meet basic needs could strain relationships, create tension, and force difficult choices between competing priorities, such as whether to sell a crop for immediate income or keep it for family consumption, or whether a child's labor was more valuable in the field than in school. And these decisions were never easy, often carrying long-term consequences that affected education, health, and opportunities for upward mobility. And even in families that maintained strong bonds, the stress and fatigue of daily life could create an undercurrent of anxiety and concern, as parents worried not only about immediate survival but also about the future prospects of their children, knowing that opportunities were limited and that the path they themselves had followed would likely be imposed upon the next generation. And this intergenerational transmission of labor and hardship reinforced cycles of dependence, limited social mobility, and enduring inequality, as children who grew up in tenant farming households were often expected to continue the work of their parents, inheriting both the land if they remained tenants, and the physical, emotional, and economic burdens that came with it. And for those who aspired to escape this cycle, the barriers were formidable, because education was limited, financial resources were scarce, and social structures reinforced the status quo, making it exceedingly difficult for individuals to carve out alternative paths. And this reality contributed to a sense of inevitability, a quiet understanding that life would be challenging, that hard work was necessary, and that the rewards of labor were uncertain, creating a mixture of pragmatism, resilience, and resignation that characterized much of rural life. And while the endurance of farmers was admirable, it was also a testament to the lack of options available, a resilience born not of choice but of necessity. And this resilience was evident not only in the physical and mental strength required to work the land, but also in the creative, adaptive strategies families employed to survive, whether through careful management of resources, inventive solutions to problems, or mutual support within communities, as neighbors often relied on each other for help with particularly demanding tasks, sharing knowledge, labor, or equipment in ways that allowed survival despite scarcity. And these networks of cooperation, while essential, were limited in scope and could not fully offset the structural vulnerabilities imposed by economic dependence, environmental risk, and social hierarchy. And the cumulative effect of these challenges left lasting marks on communities, shaping not only the lives of individuals but also the culture, expectations, and identity of rural society, because values such as endurance, self-reliance, practicality, and prudence became central to the way people understood themselves and their roles within the household and the broader community. And while these values supported survival, they also reflected the constraints of a system that offered little room for innovation, leisure, or deviation from established patterns, reinforcing the long-term impact of Edwardian rural life on personality, social behavior, and community cohesion. And over time, the combination of physical exhaustion, financial strain, isolation, and social constraint contributed to a broader understanding of inequality in rural areas, because while farmers' labor was indispensable to the nation's economy, producing the food that fed urban populations and contributed to export markets, they themselves remained at the margins of wealth, influence, and opportunity, their contributions essential yet undervalued. And this disparity created both economic vulnerability and social invisibility, as their struggles were largely unacknowledged by those who benefited from their work, reinforcing a sense of marginalization and reinforcing the hierarchical structures that governed rural and national life. And the contrast between the lives of farmers and the wealthier classes was stark, because while the upper and middle classes enjoyed access to education, leisure, healthcare, and social mobility, farmers were constrained by physical labor, economic dependency, and limited access to services, creating a lived experience defined by endurance and obligation rather than choice and opportunity. And this dynamic also affected personal aspirations, because the realities of survival limited the ability to pursue education, travel, or alternative professions, meaning that many individuals' ambitions were shaped by circumstance rather than preference, creating a tension between desire and feasibility. And over time, this tension could lead to frustration, resignation, or the quiet acceptance of a life defined by work and necessity. And yet, in the midst of these challenges, the lives of farmers were also characterized by remarkable resilience, ingenuity, and adaptation, because they developed practical skills, intimate knowledge of the land, and problem-solving abilities that allowed them to navigate uncertainty, maximize yields, and sustain households under conditions that would overwhelm most. And this practical intelligence, passed down through generations, was a form of cultural capital, a body of knowledge, skill, and experience that enabled survival and continuity, and which underscored the deep connection between people and their environment, as understanding the rhythms of the soil, the seasons, the animals, and the weather was essential to maintaining life in conditions of scarcity and risk. And these skills were not only functional but also deeply tied to identity, shaping a sense of self, pride, and purpose rooted in endurance, labor, and contribution to the household and community. And while these achievements were often invisible to outsiders, they were profound indicators of human capacity and adaptability, reflecting a nuanced balance between constraint, necessity, and ingenuity. And this balance was constantly negotiated, because the pressures of Edwardian rural life were multidimensional, encompassing economic, social, environmental, and familial domains, and each of these dimensions interacted with the others in ways that amplified hardship, limited options, and demanded continuous adaptation. And over decades, this interplay shaped not only the lives of individual farmers, but also the broader culture of rural communities, influencing norms, expectations, and values in ways that reinforced endurance, cooperation, and careful resource management, even as these same pressures limited social mobility, access to education, and opportunities for innovation. And the legacy of this life extended beyond immediate survival, because the experiences of labor, hardship, and resilience were transmitted to subsequent generations, shaping not only material circumstances but also attitudes toward work, risk, and community, creating patterns of behavior, expectation, and identity that persisted long after specific families left the land or conditions changed. And the broader societal impact of these lived experiences was significant, because the labor of Edwardian farmers sustained the economy, contributed to national food security, and supported urban populations. Yet the social, economic, and physical costs of this labor were borne almost entirely by those who performed it, highlighting systemic inequities that existed across the country. And this contrast between contribution and reward, effort and recognition, became a defining feature of rural life, shaping consciousness, social relationships, and perceptions of fairness, obligation, and opportunity. And even as the Edwardian era gave way to subsequent decades, the cumulative effects of labor, isolation, and economic dependence continued to influence rural communities, with families carrying forward the physical toll. Knowledge and adaptive strategies developed under these conditions, and the endurance, resilience, and ingenuity cultivated through this life remained central to identity and survival, while also serving as a historical testament to the challenges and perseverance of ordinary people whose labor sustained a nation. And in reflecting on these experiences, we gain a more complete understanding of Edwardian rural life, recognizing that it was not merely a picturesque or romanticized existence, but a complex, demanding, and often precarious way of life that required skill, strength, resilience, and endurance in equal measure, and that shaped the physical, mental, and social dimensions of those who lived it, leaving legacies that persisted both within families and across rural communities, illustrating the profound human capacity to adapt, endure, and contribute under conditions of sustained challenge and limited opportunity. And ultimately, it is this combination of hardship and resilience, limitation and ingenuity, endurance and adaptation, that defines the story of farmers in Edwardian England, revealing a lived experience that is as instructive as it is humbling, and one that deserves recognition for the central role it played in sustaining both households and society at large, a narrative of survival, perseverance, and human strength that continues to resonate when we reflect on the past and seek to understand the realities behind the images of idyllic countryside life often portrayed in history, because beneath the quiet fields and the traditional cottages lies a history of struggle, endurance, and remarkable adaptation. And it is within this context that we can truly appreciate the lived experience of Edwardian farmers, the demands they faced, the resilience they demonstrated, and the enduring impact of their labor on both their families and the nation they helped sustain.